So I'm going to talk again about my show. It's been a busy week in that regard. But I'm going to focus on the two digital aspects and how they fit in also to the physical story. So for those of you who weren't here, even though trying to look, I don't know if any of you weren't here yesterday, but I'll give a brief rundown again. The show is really about trying to capture computing devices not as kind of static hunks of design or kind of physical industrial history, but as kind of memory pots of experience and of use through hardware, software, and the human element. And so how do you put on display a history of that experience, and how do you capture that feeling we have with older personal computers and make that available to a gallery goer? And so that involved buying a lot of old computers on eBay, whether they worked or not, and having a timeline of 32 objects that show a progression of the physical design of computers, focusing on keyboards, styluses, and all of the touchpads, all the different things that have influenced the way we use computers in our daily life from 1973 on. So approximately 40 years, hence the subtitle, 40 Years of Personal Computing. And then to really push that one step further so that the experience of the interface is of that actual interface in action and working. So 5 core devices, the Commodore 64, the Macintosh Plus, the Palm Pilot, the iPad, and the Kinect, were designed not only to be physically tactile like the other devices, but also to have custom scripts written for them that would allow the user to not run old software, but to run a piece of software that is designed to tell the story of that device in its newness. So what it meant to use that device in 1982 for the Commodore or 1986 for the Macintosh Plus, and why the mouse was a different thing, and how we could try to bring people back in time to defamiliarize those objects a little bit, so we think about the mouse in a way that is less inherent to daily action and more explicitly focus of intellectual recognition. And so to go along with that, is also an accompanying web app that provides a lot of information on each of the objects, because a lot of the dance of this project was to tell this very rich story of computing history, which is networked, which is political economic factors, which is the kind of sociological developments over the last 40 years that have been influenced by these computers, the networks of connections in what is a kind of small industry, people who know each other, and to try to make all of those things apparent in interesting ways so that you could jump from one object to the other, and not rely specifically on this timeline, which kind of dominates the exhibition space, but more of that, like this object over here is actually related to this object over here from 20 years ago. This device on a statistic relates to this device on the statistic, and is interesting comparison of what are the best-selling computing devices or operating systems of all time. So we have the physical space of the exhibition. We have the digital interactives, which are a type of interpretive didactic media. And then we have a web app, which is usable in the gallery space in a unique way where you can input numbers to get to each of the objects, or online generally on your desktop computer, your iPad, on your mobile device to see all this different networked information. So I'm going to go through a process, and like David, I'm going to run through the really interesting work that the students helped to develop this material. And then show the final products and how they kind of specifically address a lot of these questions. So my first slide is our website, and so let's do this and see if it pops forward. Yay, wonderful. So this is the course on interface design I've been teaching for 5 years now. The first time I taught it, didn't even know I was going to do a gallery show. I didn't find out till later that year or early the next year. But it's always been a question of how are computing devices material culture. I came to the Bard Graduate Center in 2009 without a history in material culture and decorative arts or design history. I had a theater history PhD. I kind of specialized in the e-material. And I had to find a way to situate myself, and I realized these tools I was teaching with in the digital media lab had a phenomenal material presence that was often neglected. And that related in the idea of them as designed objects, which works historically, and the kind of idea of them as interfaces that are designed. Now that's a kind of a tricky question because the word interface is used for a lot of things. There's some people who just think of the interface as a software experience. Some people think the interface is just specifically the GUI desktop experience. I mentioned the other day that the word interface actually comes from fluid dynamics and the kind of point where two different types of fluid meet and the interaction they have. So I've always thought of the interface as this physical object that we touch and feel and responds and provides us feedback, that it's actually a material experience that exists in space and reacts to us. And that tracks well into a lot of the work we do here at the BGC and the way we understand material culture. So when I first taught this course, it was this idea of material objects as conduits for immaterial culture, and that there is all this information we now get over the internet, that we now get over different applications that is immaterial, that are these stories and information that come in software format, but they are only delivered to us through screens and keyboards and mice and devices. And so what is the materiality that's important about that? So went through a couple iterations developing the course, but the most recent one that I taught last fall, the students were tasked really intensely with developing the ideas for the project and to help me along. So one thing we won't necessarily, I guess we can show it here, is, since I now have it. In these pictures of the exhibition, you can see, for instance, the timeline feature, which someone has done a really cool panorama shot, which I didn't see until I was on Twitter earlier today. And they kind of figured out how to lay out the objects we had. And if you can see here, there are these lines that connect different subgroups of the objects. So there's handhelds, there's PCs, and there's operating systems and software, there's peripherals, and they've figured out a lot of the physical and spatial dimensions, investing their knowledge of the material through research and working with the exhibition designer to figure out the space. So that's one level of work they did. Another layer of work they did is that they wrote object descriptions. So each student was responsible for 5 object descriptions, which were anywhere between 400 to 700 words, I believe. And these were going to be the content of the web app we'll see later. You can only fit about 70 to 80 words on a wall label without completely losing your audience in an exhibition. But we wanted to make this more of a historical project. Like David said, we like lots of text. And it was also the idea that the book for this exhibition was less of a catalog, less of a historical survey, and more of kind of an intellectual and theoretical thesis about how to use a space. So we also wanted to provide that history. And I also wanted to provide a platform for my students to do some research and to think about how do you write for different interactive spaces for the web, for different devices. And so we set kind of a text cap, and they had to write towards that. So each student wrote 5 of these, and then I went through and edited them, and they made it up onto the website. So that was another part of their work. We can also see the object wall layout here. You can see from that original drawing that we had that this was an original drawing that guided the exhibition designer to create that wall. So the students are very involved in the actual development of the way the space looks. And then the final thing that they worked on were these gallery object scripts. So this interesting idea of having these 5 devices working and creating these digital experiences, and we were doing all of this programming on the original hardware so that they could run in the space and try to get not a true authenticity, because that's a slippery slope and a dangerous word, but a way of transporting people into their memories through that tactile experience that is as close as possible. So we could have just emulated the Commodore 64 on a PC with a contemporary keyboard, but you're losing the clunky keys, the specifics of a cathode ray tube monitor. And we wanted to evoke that so that people could begin to feel the thought of the past and use that feeling to build a better critical understanding of the type of work, the type of things they do on a daily basis with digital objects. So I didn't know what these scripts were going to be. It was, of all the stuff going into this class, that I was most up in the air about. And it made me nervous. But it also was an awesome opportunity to hand a really important part of, actually the core part of the exhibition, the core intellectual experimental piece, into the hands of my students, a group of students who hadn't experienced a number of these devices ever in their lives. The Commodore 64 was too old for most of them. The Macintosh was even too old, even though it was familiar enough a format with a keyboard and a mouse that's relatively normal. The Palm Pilot with a stylus and this weird graffiti language was foreign, even though it was similar in form factor to a smartphone, very different in use scenario. And even though it was the most recent of them, the Microsoft Kinect for the gaming system, none of the students had had any experience with them. They all knew how to use the iPad though, so that was easy. So I charged the students in a set of kind of staging out to write the scripts for 60 to 90 second experiences that you would have at one of these devices. We knew that we wanted to tell a story of the specificity of the device in that 60 to 90 seconds, that any longer and we would lose the audience. We couldn't have like a 14-minute interactive you had to go through and fully immerse. And that we wanted to capture these things in a playful and fun way as well, because the whole nature of the project has been that way. And rather than getting really somber and intellectual, memories don't flow in that space, especially in kind of this nostalgic realm, where a lot of these are video game experiences that people have had. And we really wanted to open up that enjoyability and kind of playfulness. So the students had to experiment with the devices and start using them. We had them set up in the lab. The two poor women who got the Commodore 64 as their assignment sat down and had no idea how to start using this tool. And we first ran a flight simulator with this awful joystick, which we all kept on crashing and getting shot down by the planes that were chasing us. But then they moved forward. They used a tool that allowed them to experiment with making graphics. It was called Print Shop. And they could make like interesting graphics that like was a label for the interface experience. And they started going through the process of seeing what the menus were like on a Commodore 64. You know, how do you use the function keys? What was the functionality? What are the limitations of the graphics? How were the limitations of the graphics from their perspective actually revolutionary graphics from another distance? So they went through a first iteration and it was good, but it still lacked some kind of panache. So I then took one of them down and said, here's the programmer's manual that came with the first Commodore 64. Here is a 10-line basic program. Type this in. It will teach you how to roll dice. You'll be able to hit return and it will like give you a 6 or it'll give you a 4. So you could like, it'll enhance your Uno, or not Uno, like your Yahtzee playing. So they went back and looked at the script one more time and rewrote it, and they really came up with a great idea. And it was clear that the more these students could work on it, they were going to be able to, I don't know if it was the naivete of their distance from the object, or also definitely their dedication, but each of the scripts they came up with, and they're all listed here, where they had to write scripts and they took pictures of the things they wanted to do, and they also had to do this step-by-step breakdown of what you would do, because each action defined how you would engage with the interface. And we also had to pass on these scripts to the developer, Jonathan Dehan, who's here and will be in the panel, pass that information on to make it coherent and usable, and so that we could then critique it and give them feedback. So we have these fun scripts. They also use reference to videos they found on YouTube that we then were able to turn into these interactive experiences. So the main gist of the 5 of them, and I'll be able to show you videos of 2 of them as well, is that the Commodore was, how do you use the function keys? How can you change colors on the screen? How do you load a program? Very basic things, but that were new in that first stage of the personal computer revolution, the first 5 to 6 years of these devices, where the keyboards were all unique, the operating systems were different, there really weren't standards as the way we see them. With the Macintosh, how do you do something that would have been completely alien to someone who had never used a mouse before? So the great thing that they came up with in the second group was, well, there'll be a house, and you have to redraw that house with the then awkward tools of drawing a square and using the paint bucket and using an eraser and using a drawer. So these were all features of a computer that you really didn't have before in a command line textual interface. But now with the mouse and the graphic capabilities of the Macintosh in many people's hands, you could do this type of work. And also the feeling it is to use one of those mice from 1984, which are all clunky and square and boxy and they're big one button. When we got to the Palm Pilot, they were like learning how to use graffiti. This kind of unique typography to write on the device was the important part. So they used a game that comes with the Palm Pilot called Giraffe, which drops letters, and you have to write them really fast. And the higher score you get, the better you get at graffiti. They used that to write out the word Palm Pilot, and then you could write a little memo, so that you went through the process of learning how to use the stylus and the text. On the Apple iPad, we wanted to do all the neat things that we all take for granted. You want to be able to touch with multiple fingers, to be able to swipe, to be able to tilt the device and use its gyroscope to do movement. So the interesting thing about the iPad has always been people go right up to it, they kind of plow through it in 4 seconds because they're so familiar with it. There's very little discovery. And John and I were like, well, let's add a scene. And we added a scene and added like a second onto like the 20 seconds. So that's the shortest, and it shows how familiarity and I don't want to use... I think it's an intuitive device now. I'll use the words in the ubiquitous air quotes, but it is intuitive because of its ubiquity now. People are now so familiar with picking up a device and it responding in a certain way. We actually have the problem in the exhibitions that people go up to all the screens that are just showing movies and they try to touch them to do things. And so it's like, no, that's just a movie. Like, there was a day back when screens didn't respond to your finger. And so it was fun, it was great, and they did an interesting idea where they found a children's book that uses this idea of color dots and use that as a metaphor. And it was one of those things like, let's step back to a simple, instructive, very entry-level didactic kind of piece of work and use that as our model. And then finally, the Kinect, which is a slightly broken, awkward device as it is, they went through a process of teaching you how to use the cursor and then change colors and then in a fun way to be able to move your hand. And when you move your hand, you create fireworks. So there was always ways of doing things that were playful and also colorful and took advantage of the different interfaces. So let's go back to, not there. So now we can see this is an emulation of the Commodore 64. You can see what it looks like. Play. The cursor blinks a little longer. I could have done a little better editing. So the first thing we wanted people to do was to load the software. So this is load PS8. So the really neat thing that Jonathan did, let me pause it real quickly, is that this blue screen is the ubiquitous look of what a Commodore 64 looks like. And when you go up to the screen, it looks like this. But really, this is a fake out. This is a program running that its first scene looks like the blue screen that you would normally have. So that was one of these kind of balances we had to do is how do you create an experience that seems authentic but actually works within this spectrum I defined for my students. That's the new challenge we have in the galleries is that we want to enable interactive exploration. We want to give people the possibility to find things on their own. I think that's a new mindset in our culture that people don't want to be told, they want to discover. So you want to open up interactive experiences, but the minute you open up interactivity, all of a sudden you create chaos. So the other side of this equation is how do you engage interactivity, but also mitigate the chaos of the museum experience? Because while I wanted to defamiliarize the idea of digital technology, the most alienating experience is when you go and do an exhibition and then the technology doesn't work. It breaks you out of that intellectual moment you're trying to learn, and all of a sudden you're focusing more on that particular museum's inability to execute their technology plan. And we didn't want to get caught up in that. So this was a whole dance of showing the inherent history and flaws of these devices, creating controlled structures, but also not making them so tamped down that there wasn't any kind of self-discovery. So we continue on after you load the program, where you're not actually loading a program, you're just going to the next screen. And then this was the jump forward that the students made. At first they had wanted, I don't even remember what the first model was, but it was, they were trying to recreate this graphics program, and it was too intricate and too detailed. They went away and came back and were like, well, what's really interesting about the Commodore is text input. So what if we just ask people about the exhibition? What's your favorite computer? And so you can type, I like the iMac. And then, well, why is it your favorite? Well, because it's blue. And then when you're done, you get a wall label. And then from here you have some options, right? So the function buttons were a new thing on the, so you can change the color of the background with the one button. You can also change the color of the text. I was having some fun here. So you can see how you can change those with the F1 and F3 buttons. There's also an F5 button that you can make a beep on the Commodore. That was really important. The Commodore has a really significant step forward in the audio programming chips. It allowed a bunch of different voices, which is a technical term in the audio world, and is still looked back at as a huge step forward in the way people developed sound for computers. So this simple little script captures all of that, and it's fun and it's playful, and it's hard to break, and it's really iterable, and you can go through it a couple of times and have a different type of experience, and it kind of moves forward in a fun way. The next one was the Macintosh. So here we wanted to focus on a few things. One was clicking on icons, right? You can now point and click on things. You also have menus you can pull down. You can go back if you want. So I wanted to quit this drawing, and I can go back and open the icons again. And so here's the house I mentioned. You can choose a square tool. Draw your house with your windows. Your door. Go to your paint bucket. Interesting thing about the menus you learn, that in the Apple, when you click on a menu these days, the menu stays down. With the Apple, you had to click and hold it down, which is kind of annoying. One of the things with students that you can do in the real Mac Paint, but not in this, is you can actually pull the menus off of the menu and keep them floating there, but we couldn't recreate that. So once again, that's the enabling exploration and mitigating chaos. So I was able to do my brick, I made my roof. This is kind of boring, isn't it? And so there. And then here you can clear the canvas, boop, and you can restart the whole thing, or quit draw me. So the idea here is that you're seeing a bunch of different things that were unique to the mouse, which were also unique to kind of digital publishing soon thereafter, and to create that experience. So these were the two that were easiest for me to get in emulators that we've been working on. But you kind of get the idea of that these are digital experiences, but they're not like the digital experiences we've been talking about today. That whereas we talk about kind of the accompaniment to the object or the kind of an enhancement of a collection, this is making the idea of the gallery possible. And that was a really fun challenge. And I think it's a question we're going to have to ask more and more as these types of devices are so situated ubiquitously in our life. Deborah and I were talking about this. What is the challenge of a science technology museum in the information age? What do you show? How do you show it? And this felt right to me. And it was interestingly that it connected to a question I've been having as far as being a pedagogue and going to exhibitions about performance in theater. Is that theater is this ephemeral, multi-sensual thing that takes place in a certain space and time. So what are you showing? And if you show objects, they're vestigial artifacts. They aren't the real thing. So how do you capture that? How do you teach that? When we teach theater, we spend so much time talking about the text. But it's the set, it's the interpretation of the text by the live actor on that day. It's the social historical context of your life coming into that space on the day. How do you capture showing that history and what justice does a play script or a photograph of a set design really do to that? And how do you evoke that in a pedagogical realm, in a and also in a gallery realm? And it's always interesting to see how the NYPL's library's exhibition space in Lincoln Center tries to do these types of exhibitions. And so that fed really well into this same idea of the use of the interface as an ephemeral, time-based experiential thing, and that the computer is, as a physical material culture object, is just part of that equation. And how do you recreate that? And then how do you make it didactic without being overbearing? And how do you keep it placed in a certain sense of time and space without over abusing nostalgia or kind of relying on technologies and situations that are very difficult to execute in the museum? So it was a fun set of problems to answer, and much thanks to crazy students for coming up with good answers. So along with all that, we had all this extra information we wanted to capture, and this goes back to some, one of the great things about the focus gallery is we can really engage with high-minded academic things. I wanted to make sure there were lots of time-based ways to get between objects. And I had these specific unique connections I wanted to exploit that I had found that were hard to fit in the data. I wanted there to be longer catalog entries than 75 words because these are really, they're personal to me, these devices, and they're very complex. I wanted to find ways to connect the information between the two of them. The two different objects. And there's also an interesting fetishization of numbers in the study of these technologies. How many units are sold? How long was the lifespan? And I wanted to bring that into the story, then also use that as a way to promote alternative ways of navigating the materials and the information. And then we wanted to be able to do that in a responsive environment so that you could go online at home after the exhibition, but that it also would be a way to aid your experience of the tool in the space. So we won't be able to see it, but one thing that we can do is when you're on the Wi-Fi in the BGC and you're in the gallery, you get a unique ability to have a keypad. And each of the labels has a number that's for each device. And so you can go up to the device, hit a keypad, and go directly to that device's entry in this web application so that you can quickly access that information and you can see all of the different text, images, and even video of kind of commercials from the past that are related to each object. And that was another question. So Coven before was talking about RFIDs and scanning and everything, and we had that conversation. I was like, oh, I totally want to, like, it's a tech exhibit. I want to have like the coolest little techie little graphic next to the labels, and our web developers who are amazing, and they're great designers and they're great understanders of experience. We're like, well, why don't we just have like a phone pad? Like, because like the RFID is just like a whole level of complication, and what you're doing is just 32 numbers, and that would just be a lot easier. And then we were wondering, like, there's a place where we can catch user stories, and I was like, well, we should have like an audio recording on your computers. Like, well, why don't we just use a phone number they can call and you can upload the file? And it was a great experience of like, let's talk all this through, let's not get crazy, let's find the easy answer and let's deploy that, because it'll make life a lot easier in the long run. And so one thing, I think the Focus Gallery projects have a great collaborative sensibility, and we have to learn that because there are two different kind of worlds in the BGC, here in the academic programs and the exhibitions, and it is the intersection of those points, and because it enforces the sense of collaboration, that rolls off to all the different parts of the project, and we've learned a lot from the student and the outside developers who've been involved in the work we've done. So let's go to the web app, show you some features, and then I can stop talking about my project. So one of the first things that we did was, there's this little landing page, was it was like, how do we display these objects? And I was like, I don't want a timeline. I don't mind showing these things in order. We ended up having a timeline of the space, but on the web app, I just didn't want everything to be accessed through a timeline. You know, timelines have a lot of problems. Especially when you're talking about technology, they kind of enforce a sense of progressivism, and I wanted to avoid that, at least in this space, or at least have it one of the ways that you interface with this experience. Have that be in the exhibition, but find a different way to show that material. So Chips came up with this great idea, is that every time you land on this homepage, you land with a different set of objects. But the objects are in a grid, and they're actually in order chronologically, but you don't know that right away. But what it does is it kind of gives you a snapshot of a bunch of design features that are happening at any one time. Like, what do the keyboards look like in this chunk of space? You know, what is the graphics on the software? So here's MS-DOS and VisiCalc. It looks very different from if you're going to be over on Netscape. Or once you get down to Windows 95. You know, we're starting to get smaller devices with more detailed and beautiful buttons down at the bottom. And be able to look at, to force you to zoom into that groove material, but also to be able to step back and see the whole group of objects splayed out in a larger kind of chronology. And so it's a grid too, so it has a verticality and horizontality rather than the strict horizontal or vertical sense that you would get with a traditional timeline. And then each of the objects has a page. There's just a lot of stuff on the iMac page, so I'll show this. That starts a lot of links and connections. So one thing we did is we had these kind of crappy computers that we bought on eBay, and we got our phenomenal photographer who does all the beautiful dresses for a gallery to take wonderful pictures of them. So we have this blue iMac, which I think I got for like $150 in its original box, working, and we have a couple of angles to show both, the traditional front view, but also what's important about this computer is that it has this translucent blue casing, and we want to show that off. And so the different objects that have different features like that show that off. The grid compass, we can actually go back and I'll show an example of that. So for instance, the grid compass, which is the first laptop briefcase computer with a closing monitor on top of a keyboard. So this is a great image, but what was really neat is to be able to see a side shot and then to see it close. So it's hard to show the physical movement of these objects in a web app, but to be able to capture those on the images. So let's go back to the iMac. So along with the iMac, we have a nice 300 words. It's kind of a good capsule that you might want to read online. Maybe a little longer than you're going to read next to your object in the space. But I was actually heartened by something Jennifer said before, is that like if you make a beeline for an object in the gallery, you're probably willing to read more about that. If you make a beeline for an object and take the effort to also punch the number, you'll probably sit around for 300 words. Hopefully you're that interested. If not, there's a lot of things on this screen, and this is responsive, so it looks a little different on the mobile devices. But there's a lot of places to go. So I'll get to the user stories later. There's a basic set of these device statistics, as I mentioned before. There is a chronology, but not in a timeline, more of like, these are the two objects that were near it. So one before and one after. And there's one way to navigate through the materials. There's also these custom connections that came out of the research that I did and my students did. So here we've got the Minitel, which you might not connect with the iMac initially. So the Minitel was a French terminal that connected into the telecom system which was a pre-internet information system. The French gave these out for free to anyone who had a phone, and it existed from 1982 to 2012. So it predated the actual World Wide Web by about 12 years, and really provided the French people with the ability to make reservations and make travel arrangements. At a certain level, it became their red light district online. So that's got some curious history to it. But this was a connection I wanted to make because the death of the Minitel starts with the onset of the World Wide Web and the internet kind of ascending with the World Wide Web as a visual platform to be really able to access that material. And the iMac is designed to enhance our experience of the internet. And it's these types of devices that were they were better optimized for the connection to the World Wide Web. They had graphics programs that suited developing things for web pages. So it's a device like the iMac that is related to the eventual decline of the Minitel. And so that's a little story you can kind of pack into 40 words, and is hard to make in a statistical or data way, but has a kind of nuanced connection. And we even went into that and made this page where if you click on an object, you can then click here and see those connections on a layout of the grid, so that you can see things like, so here's another one I like a lot. So Jack Tramiel, who was the founder of Commodore calculators, which turned into Commodore business machines and made the Commodore 64, was eventually ousted by his executive board for being too abrasive. The year he was ousted, he went and purchased Atari's personal computing division so he could go back and crush Commodore. So that's a fun little story that's hard. It's a hard nugget to like bury in your intellectual 300 words, but you can't miss it. And so this kind of layout was a way of doing a visualization, and Edward Tufte, who is a great kind of theorist and practitioner of visualizations, has a chapter in a book called Visual Confections. And they're visualizations that aren't based on a data set necessarily, and aren't kind of predetermined by kind of analytics or algorithms, but are crafted to tell a certain kind of story. And this was the idea behind that, is we wanted to be able to tell these connections and find a way to put them together. And it's driven by kind of a nuanced storytelling way of bringing together different ideas that don't fit into these kind of network maps you see a lot, but can fit in a similar layout as the grid that we saw before. These also connections, it's one of those hidden things that comes from student work. Let's see if we can find one that kind of bends and twists. One of our students, as we were kind of experimenting with web apps, said, wouldn't it be neat if these links kind of looked like the connectors on a motherboard? So hidden underneath this design with the circle dots and the lines is a fact of like wire and solder happening on the circuit boards of these devices. So there's a lot of thought that kind of gets embedded in the good design, and may not come out explicitly, but really informs the work that you can do. So let's do this. Go back to the iMac. Here's the iMac and Minitel connection, but I can go back to the iMac. And then the last thing I really wanted to add, something I've been interested on the side has always been the phenomenal rhetoric of the sales of these devices and the pushing them forward, and the journalistic responses to release of these devices, and the kind of fabulousness of devices or their terror, and the matching of the clock speeds and processors and pixels. And we thought one really neat way to capture that, and also to capture the history of design in particular culture moments, was to go through old magazines and print ads and get them and put them in accompaniment. So these on the bottom, there are 5 here, are different ads that were used to sell this device. And so Apple has a great design history, so these look particularly beautiful. We can even go here and the images get blown up. And I can kind of navigate. And we even found one where the Open University had gone onto the Wayback Machine, which has taken snapshots of the web over time, and went back to 1998 when this device was released, and clicked through all the pages that were relevant and made a GIF of it, and then wrapped that GIF in a Netscape browser image. So it looks like you're traveling through and looking at the iMac. So we found this like 2 weeks before the exhibition opened or something. It was like, we have to put this on the site. And then the last thing we have in those is almost every object has a really great video that was scounged from YouTube or other place. So this is a famous one with Jeff Goldblum. I think we have audio, right? Oh, come on.
presenting 3 easy steps to the internet. Step 1, plug in. Step 2, get connected. Step 3, there's no step 3. There's no step 3.
So for 32 devices, I think, what do you think? 60 ads, print ads, maybe something like that, and another 20 videos? A lot more, yeah. It's my work study. Cindy just spent hours combing through Byte magazines from the 70s and 80s to find things for these specific devices. And so what's great about this is, there's always more story than you can tell for any single object in an exhibition. And I thought that the ads are an important part of this history, and they tell so much about, oh my God, it's clearly like the late 90s. You can tell that it's a 4:3 rather than a 16:9, so you can tell when visual standards even change. You can tell who the celebrity is. The first Apple ads, they have Dick Cavett, which is definitely a time thing. And they're a way to capture a sensibility of time and history and media design to add on to the story. And that's a great thing about multimedia, is that you can put all of this on top. And I think one thing that's good about web apps, as long as you're careful, is you can pile a lot of information and allow people to kind of find their way through it and choose what they want to look at. And good design too. So rather than having a gallery of all 5 things, they're hidden and you can look at them. Even though you can, I do love this page a lot. You can actually see all of the ads laid out on a single page, which is kind of like a history of magazine, and it's like flashback. Like here's a little Nintendo one, and so there's a way of both to be gracious and gentle with your information, and then just like assault someone, and sometimes that has value too. So those are the 2 different ways that we worked through the possibilities of doing digital interpretation in this show, and they were all driven by the nature of the objects. I think that's something we've been successful in the Focus Gallery, is what is vital about the possibilities of the digital in the space to reinforce the actual physical materials. How important it is for us to bring multimedia. Our really first big experiment with these projects was an exhibition about an expedition in Burma in the 1930s by an American Museum of Natural History group that they were catching bird samples and animal samples, and they were doing anthropological work. And the whole exhibition was about the white people who were leading the exhibition, and how the only way this expedition happened was all the locals from Southeast Asia and India who were coming to support with their skill and knowledge this expedition. And so then the white guys took a film of the whole expedition for fundraising purposes, and that film exists in the Museum of Natural History archive. And so the students snipped up the important parts of it. They found amazing photography in the archives as well. And that is material that was phenomenal to integrate with maps and time in that piece. And that really got us thinking that there is so much value to providing this extra information that reinforces the objects. And just an anecdote, my favorite, this is when we had to do this interactive. There's an image of a muleteer who's injured his foot, and he's sitting on the ground receiving first aid from the perfectly healthy white guy sitting on the chair who's leaning over and bandaging his foot from the chair. And that single moment tells you a whole story about the political, socioeconomic dynamics of those expeditions. And so that's the way the media can really be a valuable tool. I won't go on anymore.